Dances of bees are about as expressive as most Hampstead novels. And the great thing about science fiction was that nobody lives in Hampstead.
Your first novel, The Drowned World, wasn't it? 1962. That imagined a future where there's been a great ecological catastrophe, polar ice caps melting. Did you write The Drowned World to a prescription? What if this would happen? Had you intimations of melting polar ice caps?
I was very under the influence of the surrealists at that time. They seemed to be painting states of mind, which I was interested in doing, because The Drowned World is also an attempt to sort of plunge down into the spinal column and descend into a more primeval world where we'll find our true selves, perhaps.
So you're talking about mindscapes as well as landscapes, aren't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, these are novels of catastrophe, the early ones, of natural catastrophes, polar ice caps melting and so on. But then I started looking at what I think of as an urban catastrophe. And I started, because by the end of the 60s, a lot of the kind of social contradictions that weren't so evident when we were all enjoying swinging London, those of us who could find a babysitter, a lot of the contradictions were coming out into the open. And I thought, there was a kind of culture of sensation that I think was ignited by the Kennedy assassination and the way that was endlessly replayed on television. And I thought, this is strange, because there's a sort of devaluation of human sympathy going on here.
Another massive effect on your life, which we needn't talk about but just record, is that your wife died very suddenly, leaving you with 3 children to bring up, which you did. That must have had a tremendous effect on your life.
Yes, it did. I mean, it absolutely shattered me. I think it probably changed everything about me, to be honest. I think I was never the same person again. My wife was 34 when she died of pneumonia while we were on holiday in Spain, leaving these 3 small children. I felt, that nature had committed a terrible crime against this young woman. It took me a long while to accommodate that into some sort of, I started writing a series of strange short fictions which were collected as the Atrocity Exhibition. The central character is a psychiatrist who's having a mental breakdown. He's obsessed with the amount of cruelty and pure sensation for its own sake that floods the world, floods TV screens and films and so on. He sets out on a sort of strange odyssey of his own in which he restages some of the most terrible events of his time, the Kennedy assassination, for example. I think it was all an attempt to make 2 and 2 make 5. And if 2 and 2 could make 5, then somehow my wife's death could be explained. It couldn't. I'd seen enough during my childhood to know death comes without any sort of calling card, just comes suddenly. And it's probably meaningless. But it takes a long time to learn that.
Crash made its appearance in the Atrocity Exhibition. 3 years later, you wrote what still could be thought of as your most controversial novel, Crash. And I can't resist quoting one publisher's reader who said, "This author who is beyond psychiatric help, do not publish." Well, it was published, and it's republished and republished and republished. Can you tell us what you were doing in that, and the way that the technology and the idea of the eroticism of the car crash drove through the book in a way that disturbed people? "Do not publish," said this chap.
I took that, by the way, as a huge compliment. Because this publisher's reader was herself the wife of a psychiatrist. And I thought, total artistic success. I think I was obsessed then with the sort of the taste for cruelty and sensation that we saw, particularly in the cinema. Feature films were unbelievably violent then, and at the center of most feature films was the car chase and, like a sort of flower, an evil flower emerging out of the sort of screaming streets, came this, the crashing cars. And no one seemed in the least put off by the car crash. There's a sort of erotic fascination that death has for us when we imagine it. I mean, the connections between sex, eroticism, and death have been explored, for hundreds of years, if not thousands. But it seemed to me that what had once been the sort of morbid playground of a small group of French intellectuals was the standard fare chosen by mass audiences who were going to the movies for the evening. They quite liked it, watching people entangled in car crashes.
You pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. Do you think it was because of that it caused so much controversy?
I wanted people to be shocked and disgusted. I wanted to expose, the perverse side of the reader's mind. I wanted to provoke the reader into facing the possibility that people are excited by violence.
The interesting thing is that 23 years later, when David Cronenberg turned into a film, it was equally controversial. Alexander Walker, then the movie critic of the Evening Standard, said, "A movie beyond the bounds of depravity," and it was banned by Westminster City Council.
Still is.
Still is. So you'd hit something that the nerve hadn't been anaesthetised, had it?
I went to Cannes when it was shown there, taking the line that this film was a sort of deeply moral statement. At this point, Walker stood up and stormed out. But I noticed that the French and Italians, the Spaniards who were there, all completely understood what Crash was about. I've often said about my fiction as a whole that, I'm not a pessimist, a man who holds a sign up saying, dangerous bends ahead, slow down, is not a pessimist. On the other hand, I sometimes tend to hold up a sign saying dangerous bends ahead, speed up, because I've got a slightly perverse delight in provoking people, just a little too far.
In your fiction, what it seems to me that you're saying is that we used to think, when we said the real world, we used to think it was out there. That was the real world, of people out there doing this, that, and the other. You're now proposing that it's become a fictional world out there, and the reality is now the responsibility of the imagination. In some of your novels, you've almost created laboratories in which to test this theory. One of these is a novel called Supercan. It's set on the Riviera, which you know very well. It can be called a detective novel. It can be called an investigative novel. It can be called a dystopian novel. But what do you think you were setting out to do?
I've been going to the French Riviera, really, since the late 40s, on holiday. And I watched it change enormously. It's changed from a playground, and the most famous playground in the world at one point, into a sort of work ground. There are motorways, heliports, science parks that have sprung up. And one of the largest, the Sophia Antipolis, it's a huge science park where people live in the residential enclaves within the science park. People there have an odd look in their eyes. It's unmistakable. That's the sort of look you see in the eyes of people on the other side who are looking at you through barbed wire, watchful, dulled, sort of anaesthetized. And I thought, what will happen to these people if they stay too long here? And I visualize in Supercan a society of utterly exhausted senior executives who only get their joie de vivre by joining little groups who go out at night and attack immigrant families